while we get these slides.
There we go. Great. So I'd like to talk to you about cost reimbursable contracts and put a bit more meat on the bone of what that means for the construction sector. Sorry guys, I don't think there we go. So the brief agenda is I just want to give a brief introduction to myself and then explain what cost reimbursable contracts are. We might have a quick discussion around pain and gain share mechanics, and most importantly, when should cost reimbursable contracts be used in the construction sector? I'd then like to talk about the opportunities and challenges that these forms of contracts present, both to the contracting community and to the clients procuring construction projects. We might have a look at one or two case studies and draw some conclusions. So I've just shared with you a sort of a timeline of my career, and the reason for doing that is to say to you that when I started my career back in 1994, I went and worked in the UK in the contracting sector and had over a decade there. And the interesting thing about the UK construction sector at that point in time is that it was being heavily criticised for being overly adversarial, poor levels of efficiency, poor levels of collaboration. And some of you in the room may be aware of things like the Egan report, which was reconstructing the team, and subsequently the Latham report, which was rethinking construction. So at that time, they were going through some similar discussions to what we're talking about today in terms of is our construction industry fit for purpose? And they moved to a much more collaborative approach and relationship in the construction sector. So I spent the first decade of my career experiencing that from the contractor's point of view. And then when I moved back to Ireland in 2005, I worked in the public sector and spent over a decade there, where I got, an appreciation of what it was like on the buying side of the industry and the challenges with procuring contracts, contractors, the benefits of and the disadvantages of fixed price and the circumstances when that works and when it doesn't work. So I hope that I can present a balanced view on this particular topic, having spent time both in contracting and on the public sector side. So, what are cost reimbursable contracts? I suppose the first thing to say about them is that it's all about the method of paying the contractor. And many of you will be very familiar with this, but you don't base the payment on a schedule of rates or a bill of quantities, you base it on the actual cost of the contractor. And on top of that, then there's a fee applied. The actual costs of the contractor are ascertained through their accounts and records on an open book basis. And that's a pretty fundamental shift for most contractors to open their books. The fee percentage that is added on to the actual costs is intended to cover overhead and profit. And in some instances, contractors may choose to add risk into that. But I suppose, the immediate thing that will strike you about it is that it's not fixed price, because anything that's based on the actual cost, well, obviously it's variable. So that would be a concern if you were procuring it, but there are mechanisms in place to control that, and I'll now move on to those. So the first thing to say is that not all costs are reimbursable under a cost reimbursable contract. And I'd like to use the NEC4 as probably the gold standard in cost reimbursable contracts. And under that form, it is quite prescriptive as to what costs are allowable. There's a schedule of cost components that says, what costs are allowable. And if it's not on that list, well, then you shouldn't be applying for it. A very good example of that would be perhaps head office functions of a contractor, the finance department or the HR department. The cost of those people are not appropriate for the project. Similarly, the concept of working area. If you're going to pay your contractor based on their actual costs, well, then I think it's fair that you can actually see what's going on. So labour, plant, materials, and indeed people costs have got, they're allowable only if they're within the working area so that the client has got line of sight on them. And then there are disallowable costs, which are costs which would otherwise be allowable, but under the contract are being rejected. And an example of this may be ordering materials in excess of what was required, allowing for reasonable wastage. It could also be related to perhaps the correction of defects, and under the NEC4 form of contract, as a contractor in a cost reimbursable contract, you're allowed to fix a defect once. None of us are perfect, but if you're doing it for the second and third time, those costs are disallowable. So there are control measures there to give comfort to a client under a cost reimbursable contract that it's not an open checkbook as some may perceive. And then I suppose the most important feature of them is that there's an incentive there upon the contractor to minimise their costs. And that is achieved through a pay and gain share mechanic, which I'll talk about a bit more, and the use of a target price. So the target price is an estimate of what the actual cost of the contractor and including his fee at the end of the job. And that is normally provided at tender stage. So to some extent that tender price gets put in a drawer for the majority of the construction project, because you really only need to take it out again at the end. I am oversimplifying things a bit, but in order to calculate the pay and gain share mechanic. And the pay and gain share mechanic is very simple. If the actual costs exceed the target, well then obviously there's a sharing of that excess between the parties. And similarly, if the actual cost plus the fee is less than the target price, well then there's a sharing of the gain. This is not a sort of an arbitrary 50-50. There is a format for doing this, and it is set out clearly in the contract. In the blue diagram there, I've shared with you a typical model, and there's no right or wrong answer to it. Each model is different, but I suppose the important point is that it's incremental. So in the model that's on the screen there, you'll see that between 90% of the target and 110% of the target, so 10% either side, there's a 50-50 sharing of the pain and gain. And on this particular model, the client gets the greater share of savings as the savings percentage comes down, and the contractor takes the greater share of the pain as the actual costs go further away from the target. And I'm not suggesting that's a good or bad model, it is a model. So the important thing is that there are some principles, and you need to think carefully about how this pay and gain share mechanic works, because it has a huge influence both on the behaviour of the contractor and the relationship. The most important thing to say about it is that it is calibrated in a manner, or it should be calibrated in a manner that encourages the contractor to minimise costs, of course. And an ideal outcome in a cost reimbursable contract would be for the actual costs to be maybe 5% below the target. That would be a win-win for everybody. It doesn't always happen, but that's what you're aiming for. And certainly in calibrating your pay and gain share mechanic, that's something that should be at the forefront of your mind. It's important not to do it in a manner that is self-serving and biased towards one party or the other. And obviously it's normally the public sector or the construction employer who's setting and calibrating the pay and gain share mechanics. So it's important not to put it too onerous that it perhaps encourages the contractor to concentrate on changing the target. And I suppose finally just to say that it should make the administration of the contract relatively straightforward, so not to make it overly complicated. So they're the control measures that are in place under cost reimbursable contracts. When would you use one? Why would you use one? And I suppose the first thing is, if you can't define the scope of your project, or if your design isn't mature enough, well then perhaps you should not be asking the market to give you a fixed price lump sum, because you don't know what it is that you want to build, and therefore there's going to be a lot of change, a lot of variation, a lot of claims, and that's going to be an issue. It also would be appropriate perhaps to use cost reimbursable contracts on particularly complex projects, and David O'Brien referred to it, the likes of Metrolink, railway projects, where there's a lot of interfaces. There's perhaps a number of contractors that need to come together to deliver a project, and managing the interfaces between those in a lump sum fixed price adversarial type environment is going to lead to a lot of claims, so you may look for a different approach. And this is just a quick diagram of the contracting model. For the purposes of this discussion, the reimbursable costs and indeed the target cost would fall under the reimbursable bracket. And you can see that they become more relevant the greater the value, but most importantly, the greater the complexity of the project that you're trying to procure. Other reasons why you might use a cost reimbursable form of contract would be to promote a collaborative relationship between the parties, particularly if you take a long-term view of it. And a really important one for construction clients and the public sector in particular, in order to gain a true picture of what projects cost. At the end of a fixed price lump sum contract, when you've washed up all the claims and all the variations, I don't know, do you know whether you've paid the right price for things or not? When it's a cost reimbursable form based on actual costs, assuming the contractor has been reasonably efficient, you know how much it costs to build that particular asset. So it's very valuable from that point of view. A key part of cost reimbursable contracts, and we've spoken about it a lot this morning, is presenting a more reasonable risk profile to the market. And, lump sum fixed prices all the time, particularly on complex projects and where the scope isn't fully defined, is not a risk profile that's reasonable, and it will not attract the level of competition that the public sector in particular need in order to drive value for money. So in some instances, it may prove counterproductive. And you may decide to use a cost reimbursable form of contract because you want to promote the changing culture in the construction industry, to allow the contracting community to be more stable, to be more financially stable, and to facilitate the ambition that we have for building our country. Just quickly, some of the standard forms, NEC4 has been mentioned a lot this morning, but there are other forms of cost reimbursable contracts. The ICME is one that I have experienced myself in the UK in my earlier career. FIDIC are currently have a working group looking at collaborative and cost reimbursable forms of contract. And we have the early contractor involvement model under the Public Works, but I'm not clear exactly if that gets used much. So what are the advantages or opportunities from the contractor's point of view? The big one, of course, is reduced risk and less exposure to losses. And that's a huge win for the contractors, and a really important one that should be supported. These forms of contract are typically accompanied by a neutral cash flow position, so the contractor gets paid their actual costs each period, each month. But as part of your application for payment, not only are you applying for the cost that you've incurred, i.e. the money that's gone out of the contractor's bank account, but you're also forecasting to the date when you're going to get paid, which will be typically 28 days later, the costs that are going to go out of your bank account in that 28-day period, so that when you get paid, you're on a cash neutral basis. Again, something very important for the financial strength of our contracting community. It would obviously help develop trust and better working relationships because by its nature it is less adversarial and much more collaborative than fixed price lump sum. And because of that less adversarial environment, there is perhaps an opportunity to attract more talent, to attract a more diverse workforce to the construction sector, which has its advantages when we're talking about scarce resources. In my experience, in a cost reimbursable and a more collaborative environment, it does encourage contractors to invest in innovation and to take a longer term view. From the client's point of view, some of the advantages are, as I mentioned already, full visibility over project costs, collaboration with the supply chain, and in particular, getting the supply chain and the contractors to focus on the project objectives rather than their own self-interest. So there's an alignment between the parties in terms of trying to make the project work. So there's less claims and disputes, which is obviously a clear function of the fact that it's a more collaborative environment. There's also an opportunity to improve the project schedule. You can engage a contractor at a much earlier stage in a project under a cost reimbursable form of contract than you would perhaps under a fixed price lump sum while you wait for the design to mature and the scope to be clarified. There is greater competition during the tender stage because it's a more reasonable risk profile that you're presenting to the market, and therefore that will drive a better value for money in overall terms. Just 2 more slides. I'll speed along, I'm conscious that we're running late. Some of the challenges associated with cost reimbursable contracts, starting with the contractor side. Open book, transparency, the right to audit your accounts and records is something that is obviously very different, and that can challenge contracting organisations, particularly their accounting departments. It's fair to say that there is a significant administrative burden associated with these forms of contract, but I would argue that the additional administrative burden is saved in the amount of time and money you might spend on disputes and claims. There is a cultural change needed. There's much more collaboration and transparency, and that's a challenge for people who have been in an adversarial environment up to this point in time. There's cost and accounting systems that need to be improved. There's expertise in this area, and that's just for the main contractors. When you think that they've got the same challenges are going to be faced by tier 2 and tier 3 subcontractors, there's definitely work to be done to make it possible. From the client's point of view then, there's obviously greater risk, less certainty around the outturn cost of the project, but I did speak already about some of the mechanics that you can do to manage that. A big question is, does the client get the A-team? If a contractor is sitting in their head office and making a decision to put the A-team on a fixed price lump sum contract or on a cost reimbursable contract, which is going to be the more difficult for them. So it's important that contractors do give their A-team to these projects under this form of contract. The supply chain, this is a really important point. There's no point in having a cost reimbursable open book relationship with just the main contractor. On big projects, the main contractor's direct costs may be 20 or 30% of the overall project costs. And if you don't have visibility of the subcontractor costs, well, then you don't really have visibility of the true actual cost of the entire project. So the flow down of these obligations into the supply chain is a really important thing that clients need to concentrate on and deliver. And some of the other advantages I've mentioned in terms of cultural change, challenges in terms of cultural change, resources and data management. So I'm just going to skip a slide or two. There's some case studies. Look, Hong Kong, Ireland, the UK, cost reimbursable contracts are used a lot more abroad than they are in Ireland, but there are some really good examples, and Brian Collier is on shortly. We've been supporting a project in Dublin Airport which has gone really well under cost reimbursable forms of contract, a very challenging contract. So just to draw some conclusions and to wrap things up, and I suppose to pose some questions to the audience, can we deliver the National Development Plan, Climate Action Plan, and all of the private sector investment in the built environment that's going to happen over the next decade? Can we do that with what is predominantly an adversarial construction industry, which is characterized by project overruns, claims and disputes, and in some instances insolvencies? Can we attract international contractors? A lot of the major projects that we want to deliver in this country over the next 10 years are going to need the support of the international contracting community in partnership with domestic contractors. Will they come to Ireland and help us build our projects if we don't have a system and a contracting model that is attractive to them? On climate action alone, when you think about all of the retrofitting that has to be done, the renewable energy, the scale and pace with which we need to deliver that, what is the right contracting model for that to get it done quickly? Is it adversarial or is it more collaborative and perhaps using cost reimbursable contracts? Can we attract talent into the industry if it is seen as a very adversarial, male-dominated environment? And what is that going to do for the diversity and the capacity of the industry in the short, medium and longer term? And can we change the culture is it possible to change the culture of the industry to be more collaborative, to be more cooperative, to adopt a fairer apportionment of risk between the parties to a construction contract, to be fair about the reward, and to promote the financial stability of our contractors. And I suppose the final thought that I might leave you with, because obviously this is all about affordability, can we afford not to change? Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you.